Well, Greg, great to see you again. Sorry to disrupt your break, but good to see you with the tan there.
Yeah, it's coming on, don't you think? Factor 50 for me, Sean. That's I don't go lower than that.
Well, the topic for today is air-to-air refueling. Why do we need it? How we used to do it, and also, how we've gone from the old legacy aircraft to a PFI, a private finance initiative run by AirTanker. And we're very fortunate to have Mark Alexander, the chief exec, going to join us a bit later. But first of all, I think certainly when I've chatted to family and friends, a lot of them don't even know why we do air-to-air refueling. Probably worth just a few moments on what that's all about, why the service has been doing it for many decades.
Yeah, I mean, I think as soon as man started flying, it became quite clear that there were limitations. You ran out of fuel, and there are no or there weren't petrol stations in the sky. Well, now there are. And it's all about getting further and further or staying up for longer and longer. And initially, I think you've got some good historical examples to show us. But, initially it was about flying commercially, being able to travel halfway around the world or wherever. But in the military sense, the ability to travel further with your aircraft, and we've seen so many examples over the last 12 months, whether it's RAF Typhoons flying over Syria, Yemen, whether it's the Americans flying all the way halfway around the world into Iran, it gives you the penetration, the range, or it gives you the endurance to stay on combat patrol in somewhere like Poland, as it happens in the last couple of days. And you can stay up there for, 4, 6, 8 hours with a tanker just keeping you topped up. So, yeah, it's all about the reach and the endurance. It's a petrol station in the sky.
Yeah, because I remember one of my early days in the military, I was the last sort of group going through training before, that was going to the Lightning before they brought that out of service. And I remember the guys going onto that saying if you left it in full heaters with the reheat going, after 7 minutes you'd be in space, but you'd also completely run out of gas in 7 minutes. And of course, that was an air defense aircraft. So the only way you could actually go into intercepts was you had to go and fill it back up again. And as you say, going back to the 1920s, there were some biplanes that did air-to-air refueling with each other. And there's some lovely pictures. We've got a picture here of them trailing a hose out of one biplane down towards the other one. A guy would step out the cockpit, grab hold of it, stuff it into the fuel tank. And I think it was back in 1923, some DH-4Bs. They actually did a 37-hour trip deliberately to see how long they could do it with 9 sets of refueling, but they also had to put a load of oil in it as well. So it's nothing new. I think the biggest, you and I have done lots of tanking. I think we do in this country though, probe and drogue, where we've got a probe fitted to the aircraft, you pop it out into the airflow, a basket is hanging at the end of a long pole and it bounces around a bit and you have a bit of a stab and a joust. The trouble is, we used to have VC-10s and TriStars, but I don't know about you. We used to also be able to tank off the C-130, the Hercules, and that was fine, except it went a bit slower. So we were having to be slower behind it, which a jet doesn't really like, and it certainly doesn't like when it's heavy. But also, these blasted Spanish tankers would go into cloud, and you'd be flying along with a wing bouncing up and down. The basket's now bouncing up a lot up and down. And you're literally behind it and watching this basket flash past you every now and again, waiting for it to settle down before you go, oh, and jump into it. You must have a couple of dits yourself as well from those times.
Never missed, never missed. Yeah, look, it's one of those things that you just cannot explain to someone. You can pretty much explain everything else about military flying and be quite blasé about it, because actually, we did get quite blasé. Flying around at 500 knots, 100 feet off the ground was almost, a normal thing to do. When you get behind that tanker for the first time, and this hose that you would think would be nice and stable is not necessarily flailing, that would hopefully not be the case, but it is moving. And as you get closer and closer to the basket, it moves away from the bow wave of the aircraft. So you almost need to aim to miss, because the basket's going to move up when you get there. I mean, I've tanked off I pretty much everything. I mean, I started on Victors. That's how old I am. In the Tornadoes back in the day, but KC-135s, the Canadian 707s, the ones that had the little, I mean, I remember going up behind a tanker and I was told it was a KC-10 with a centerline hose. And when I got there, it wasn't. It was one of the ones that with a boom, and it had, I think it's only got about, I don't know, 10 meters of hose. It's probably less. And it doesn't reel back in. It's fixed. And the only way you can get fuel to flow is you bend 90-degree in the pipe. So you have to push forward. Once you're in, you have to push forward and bend a 90-degree. And I was doing this in an F-18, and the trick was it used to just spin. And a lot of guys said, no, what you do is just lay the hose on your nose. So we used to do it and lay the hose on the nose of the aircraft to stop it spinning. One of the guys didn't do that, and he just sat there with it gently spinning, and he suddenly fell out. And the reason he fell out, as we found out, is the end of the probe was screwed on and was screwed on 12 times. And he unscrewed it 12 times and it came off. So he left an end of his probe in the basket. Yeah, I think every trip I've ever done, even in operations where you've been shot at, the most exciting bit is the tanking, especially in the dark.
A lot of people would spoke, wouldn't they? They would end up, because as you say, you're meant to, so I don't know what it's like in the Tornado or the team, but certainly in the Harrier, the probe you couldn't actually see unless you turn around. If you did that, you'd be chasing it. So you had to just commit. Yeah. And of course, everybody had a little peak. And if you had a peak, you'd suddenly respond. And that meant you were going up when the basket was coming down. You could very easily stuff the probe through the side of the basket. Some people came back with the basket still on the end of their probe and had to come back, at the end of it. And the number of kids who'd come back in the early days who they'd been chasing it, and the thing would be bouncing around the canopy, scratching the canopy. And so a lot of our junior pilots, if they hadn't done it properly, would be out there on the line polishing the canopy again.
There's some pretty good horror videos on YouTube where you can see a catalogue of incidents, and they can get quite nasty quite quickly. You really need to respect moving around the tanker, and the instructors you say don't look at the basket. Of course, everybody looks at the basket. The trick was, by all means, look at the basket, but don't then go chasing it. Try and move in and out, up and down the line of the hose. But it's a really reassuring feeling when you're in and the fuel is flowing and you go, oh, thank God for that, I've got enough gas. When you're over, and I've done it coming back from Australia, over the South China Sea, and you're waiting to be last one in, and you realise you are right on the limit. And if you don't get in first time, you are diverting to God knows where. The pressure's on.
So both of us had a lot of experience this, but it used to be on VC-10s, TriStars, and as you say, you're old enough for Victor stuff. But we did forget, really, we had long memories. It wasn't very reliable. Fuel economy wasn't great. And it was back in, I think, 2005 when the British government decided we would actually look at a different way of providing more modern tankers, but we were going to have to spend billions. And that's why the private finance initiative was worked out. AirTanker won it, and they came into service, I think it was 2016. They're about halfway through the delivery phase of that contract now. So it's a really good opportunity, I think, for us to chat to Mark, to find out exactly from his perspective, because he was in the army as well. Let's just get a flavour of exactly what this feels like, the good things, the bad things, and actually what it means for the future as well.
Yeah, I lost count how many times you got a radio call saying the tanker's cancelled. It was more often not there than there. And that's no fault of any individual, but the VC-10 by that stage was knackered. Yes, you could use the TriStar, but the TriStar was always busy doing other things. And of course, the time when this PFI came in was a time when defence didn't have the money. You couldn't have gone out and bought yourself some new tankers. So it was that necessity as much as anything. And so, it's hats off to the people that came up with the concept and came up with a model that has survived the test, I think. I mean, we'll hear from Mark and see what he has to say. But just comparing how it was when you and I were doing it and how it is today, it's chalk and cheese.
Right. Very, very warm welcome to Mark. Welcome to the podcast today, Chief Exec of AirTanker. As a former Army guy as well, you'll have a bit of an empathy from what the military requirement is, as well as the industry side. Can we start off just by looking, this was the contract for air-to-air refueling with AirTanker was a PFI. It was sort of relatively early days. And over the years, PFIs have come into for a degree of criticism, and yet the reason you've got two of us on here is we remember vividly what it was like before we had the Airbus in place. VC-10s and TriStars, really unreliable, often not there at all, often going home because they had some unserviceability. But it is funny that some of the people have short-term memories. What's your perspective as chief executive of AirTanker of the success and otherwise of the PFI, particularly also with your military head on as well?
I guess we probably all had experience of PFIs in various forms outside, and I'm certainly not going to be spending time defending PFIs, but I will defend the AirTanker PFI because I think in some ways it is unique. It was set up with a specific purpose in mind. It was set up as a competition, so they looked at the other models, whether to do it in-house or do it differently. But I think the PFI model worked, and the reason I say that is that the PFI model allowed something in the region of 2.7 billion of industry investment to be put into that tanker contract to generate the capability, to procure those new aircraft, to do the conversion, and to deliver and set up the basis, I should say, for delivering that throughout the 27 years life of the contract itself. So I doubtless say, we might come on to it, there may be room for improvement in some aspects if we were going to look in the future at the extension. But the PFI itself, I think, worked well. It wasn't just about the way the finance was set up. I think the other thing to keep in mind is the integrated way in which the company was set up in conjunction with the Royal Air Force. So if you've ever had the pleasure of coming down to our building at Bryce Norton, just going to use that as a little bit of an analogy for how integrated it is. So the building's got 3 floors. The top floors are given over to 10 and 101 Squadron. So the warfighters are on the top floor. They've got to walk a very small number of yards to come and put their hand around the throat of the Chief Operating Officer or me if they're not getting what it is they need. Bottom 2 floors are full of a mixture of some embedded RAF engineers. We've got Air Force employees that are now a member of the company. I think we've got something like 15% of the company are veterans. We've got 17% of the company who are sponsored reservists. And we've got in the region of half of my executive team are veterans in themselves. And at the back end, you've got the hangars. So in terms of generating an integrated capability, which is what the Strategic Defence Review is now looking for, the Defence Industrial Strategy is suggesting we move forward to encourage more of that warfighting mindset. I think that PFI was a little bit prescient in what it forecast, and that's what it is that it set up.
So one of the things that, just before Greg comes in, I just want to pick up a couple of things there. One of which is that it was early days. There are positives and negatives, and I mean, bluntly, I think both Greg and I are, relieved that we've had a much more reliable service. But the critics would also turn around and say it hasn't been as flexible as when we were doing it ourselves. How much of that do you think is just the nature of the contract? Is any of that actually justified?
I think the contract is very flexible, but it does require all the parties involved in it to understand the contract. When it was written 12, 14 years ago, both parties put considerable resource and expertise in order to generate a contract which looked a long way forward. The contract allows you to do an awful lot. Certainly in my short period, 2 years, I haven't come across anything that we haven't been able to do. Now, sometimes the time for those decisions to be made takes a little while. We have to go and get approval from lenders, so that can come across as slow, but it's not a flexibility argument. The contract was set up to be flexible and to provide a certain amount of rigor in the way the contract was managed in order to allow industry to put 2.7 billion into this and ensure that over the 27 years it was going to get the return that was allowed within the contract. So I do think it's flexible, and we've got examples of maybe where we've not stepped outside it, but where we stepped into things that maybe weren't foreshown. So one example of that might be looking to put a SATCOM capability on one of the aircraft and maybe the rest of the fleet in order to provide wideband SATCOM to that platform for use through cabin Wi-Fi. That might be one example. Another example might be the use of sponsored reservists. So I mentioned the number that we've got. That's about 130 that we've got now, 30 pilots and about 100 engineers. those numbers were never envisaged at the start, but we put in some of that's been compensation in order to provide pilots and engineers for some of the challenges that the Royal Air Force has found. But that number could equally roll off if that recruiting and retention goes up. So those are just two examples where I'd say the contract has been flexible. But I come back to it does require all the parties involved to understand what the contract allows for and know how to get that agreement to work in the right way.
So, Mark, I can testify that I've seen that flexibility with the way that the aircraft can be flexed in and out of use, and whatever tasking turns up. I've seen you guys deliver no matter what or no matter where. But outside the contract, and I don't have the contract in front of me, and there are a couple of examples that I know get picked up on by a lot of people. One is, does it preclude the Air Force, for example, making the A400M tanker capable? Is that, if you like, is that a disclaimer within the contract? And also, where do we stand with booms? Now, that's probably the bigger question to answer. So I'll let you do that one second. But does it preclude the use of other tankers?
There is an exclusivity clause in the contract that ensures that all operational air-to-air refueling is conducted through AirTanker. But there have been a lot of examples where that air-to-air refueling is being provided by other platforms, by other nations, and there's a mechanism for recovering that. And if we were looking to the future, and the Air Force wanted to go further and develop an A400 AAR capability, which does exist, so it comes from Airbus. Airbus could put pods on those tankers, then we'd be prepared to have that conversation. But it would need to be part of a balanced discussion about what that extension come 2035 actually look like.
Yeah, and obviously you may not want to get into the details, because although it is 2035, I think you and I would all agree, and I know Sean agrees with me, that we're in a changed world currently.
Very much.
And therefore, a contract written, over a decade ago is how valid is that? So maybe that is a way forward. So where do you see?
Sorry, Greg. I'm just going to come back just to make sure there wasn't a misunderstanding. 2035 is when the current contract ends. If we are able to continue the conversation that we've already started with MOD about a contract extension, it doesn't require us to wait until 2035, whereby we allow that. So coming back to your other point about booms, for example, if in the next couple of years we can find a way to extend that contract, complying with all of the rules, then there's a way for AirTanker, with its shareholders, to introduce a considerable amount of money back into that new contract in the region of 1 to 2 billion. And that 1 to 2 billion could be spent on a number of things. So I guess starting off with probably one of the most urgent is just to deal with the military obsolescence side of the existing fleet. At the moment, that's funded by the MOD. That was a decision taken a long time ago. That funding could be brought back inside, and AirTanker take on the responsibility for doing that. That would be one thing we could do. We could then look to your second question around a boom capability. So that boom capability wouldn't need to wait till 2035. We could actually start working on that now. Now, the earliest that could be available, and that is a dependency depending on which way you go. So if we were talking about a new aircraft, a new multi-role tanker transport plus, that's the aircraft that comes fitted with a boom, then probably you're looking at 2031 before we would be able to get in at the front of that production line in order to get hold of that capability. If we wanted to do a retrofit, that could be done slightly earlier, but then we need to have a discussion about what is the cost benefit of doing a retrofit on an aircraft that's already halfway through its life, as opposed to a newer aircraft, which would be able to go a lot further than 2035, probably out to 2060, 2065, and comes with a whole load of other benefits, like an upgraded avionics suite. It's slightly simpler to fly. It's got new engines on it, so therefore you're going to get better efficiency, longer range, or bigger give from the tanker. And that's a discussion that we started with the MOD already. I mean, I think that it would be true to say everyone's waiting for the starting pistol to be fired in the form of the Defence Investment Programme, which we're hoping will see the light of day later on this year, beginning of next. But the work has already started. It's been going on for about a year in the
Yeah.
discussions with MOD. We've got a very good working relationship with the Voyager delivery team, very good relationship, at least from my point of view, with the Royal Air Force, in looking at what those options are. And boom is front and centre, and probably being driven quite hard by some of the recent decisions around procurement of F-35A.
Yeah, look, thanks for that. It makes it really clear, and yeah, I completely understand the extension element and how you can bring that forward from the current contract end. But that's really positive news. I think we know that the MOD perhaps has been somewhat hamstrung as it's waited for the SDR and all the funding decisions, and of course money is still tight. But yeah, that's really welcome news. Great stuff.
And I also just a couple of points I pick up on that. One of which is Greg alluded to. It seems a very different world today, Mark, than the day in which the AirTanker contract was let. You know, we were post-Cold War. It was all about expeditionary warfare. It was all about, you know, peacetime, etc. You know, ever since 2022, the invasion by Russia, it feels like a different world. It feels like a war of national survival. And we couldn't possibly have known when the contract was written back in the day that we were going to be in a very different world today. I wonder if that, what's your reflections on sort of lessons learned from that time about the contract? Because bluntly, you know, often we blame industry for the contract, but the MOT were the ones that engaged in that process. What are the lessons that could be learned, and how do you, at least in principle, how do you make contracts like that able to do a sort of mid-course update without the rest of industry bleating foul?
So, I'm conscious of saying that I wasn't around when the contract was written, and that's not by way of a disclaimer, because I think the really smart men and women that wrote that contract on both sides were really foresightful in what they were anticipating. So the contract did anticipate going to war. It anticipated transitioning through crisis, tension, war, and a whole bunch of provisions in there to allow us to deal with that. It has, for example, clauses in there that require us to maintain a certain number of deployed operating bases, upwards of 6 simultaneously for a period of time. Now, that time period might be something that we reflect on to say, was it too short? But it was certainly several months of sustainment of those deployed operating bases. So it was thinking that way. But of course, when it was written, you know, we were in the golden age of the peacetime dividend, and maybe that's something that we come back to look at should the contract be extended. I think it also anticipated the warfighting element insofar as the use of those sponsored reservists. So that was always there from the get-go. I mentioned previously that that's grown. We've got a purpose, well-defined purpose within our company, which resonates completely with the RAF. So our purpose line is defence of nations and the success of our customers. And the company truly believe that. The 850 people who are employed by AirTanker, not to mention the embedded RAF and the 2 squadrons, really believe in that purpose. They are, I wouldn't say wedded to it, but they get after it. So when we have successful operations, which aren't possibly as extreme as where we might land up with Russia, but where we talk about the mission that was announced earlier this week to go and look to provide air capability for the defence of the eastern flank following the drone incursions, I'm going to call them, into Romania and into Poland. The company were really pleased to see that we're going to be part of that RAF force. We're going to be supporting it in order to deliver it. When we had the Carrier Strike Group making its passage down through the Middle East and across to Australia, people in the company are genuinely proud, identify with why it is that we're doing that. That demonstration of power projection and being part of it. And the same would apply to the missions that took place during Iraq and Afghanistan, the 10 years that we've been spent on Op Shader in the Middle East, not to mention the recent attacks that took place in the Middle East, whether they are Houthi or Iranian, in terms of the defence of drones and that attacks, where AirTanker played its part as being a cornerstone of that air power capability that the UK contributed to that effort.
Do you think, Mark, just picking up on that AirTanker is a great example, I think, of using veterans, reservists and the like. there is a danger that's sort of seen as just, old boys coming in. But actually, what you're describing is a culture that it has an empathy and an understanding with the warfighting ethos. How important do you think that is to the company?
Really important, and I won't take exception being one of those old boys. I won't take the fun to that comment. If you gave me a rifle, I'd know which way to point it. But I do think it's important, and I'd have to say it's not just the old boys. We annually recruit upwards of 12 technical apprentices, engineers. We have 12 spaces. We have over 300 applicants every year for that. And those men and women, and there's a really good balance. We're starting to see a good bunch of diversity in there now. Almost 50% of the last cohort were female. Those youngsters, 16, 17 years old, they're wanting to join a company like AirTanker because they believe that what it is that we support, the defence of our country, the defence of democracy, is something worth giving their service towards, and they're proud to be part of a company that's associated with it. Yes, they hear all the old war stories from old boys like me and the engineers out on the hangar floor, but when you speak to them at interview, it's right there. They get it.
Yeah, Mark, I remember visiting your team out in Cyprus over 10 years ago now, and I couldn't tell the difference. I had to ask who was who to figure it out. And they almost, they don't treat themselves as different either. That became readily apparent. But the SDR talked about the vulnerability of Bryce Norton, and you talked about 6 locations. So I just want to tease you a little bit about, and you can't say too much probably, about what sort of challenges that brings. Because I know the Air Force talks about the ACE concept of deploying and making themselves less vulnerable. And of course, we all know that rather unfortunate incident in June on the station, where 2 of your aircraft were damaged. I mean, it'd be quite interesting to hear how you recovered from that and how you view that as well. Because I think there's a good news story there, but I'm teasing you. See if you'll tell us.
I think everyone was shocked, maybe a little bit surprised, and in some cases a little bit angry about that incident. And we can go into the whys and the wherefores of that. I'd rather focus, however, on what AirTanker, along with others, did to respond to it. At the time of that incident, took 2 aircraft out of the availability of the fleet. And I think it was a real testament to certainly the organisation that I saw as to how quickly they got after getting those aircraft back on the line. I think the first aircraft was back operational within 7 days. And the second one followed about 10 days after that, and we recovered that in less than 21 days. And it really generated a focus within the business. So it played to there was a slight affront to the fact that it happened. People were angry, but they were motivated. Everyone got in behind the engineers to allow them to do what it is that they needed to do, and not just the people at AirTanker, but also the suppliers, Rolls-Royce and Airbus, also understood the gravity of that situation and pulled out a lot of stops in order that we got those aircraft back up and flying as quickly.
Yeah, great effort. As it happened, I had to be driving around the perimeter fence the week before that. It wasn't me, by the way. And I remember as an ex-station commander, and Sean is too, I was admiring Bryce Norton's fence as way better than my one when I was at Barham, but there you go. Yeah, look, it was a superb effort. I'm surprised people didn't make more of it. But in terms of the use of other airfields, other airports, is that something that you've actively, you understand and you think you can deliver?
We do, and it's regularly practiced. You're probably aware that next year is when Bryce Norton has its runway resurfaced. It's been overdue for some time. I think everyone's looking forward to it happening I think it's July next year. And one of the reasons for that is because during periods of real intensity, the surface of that runway gets a little bit sticky. So quite regularly, we've had to redeploy our aircraft, what it's called bolt holing, to different airports around the UK and elsewhere in order to disperse the fleet. So we're quite well practiced in doing that and putting the support arrangements in place, some of it for some time. We've got 2 permanent deployable operating bases down in Cyprus, one down in the Falkland Islands. So we've got our teams regularly down there on a recursive basis. And during some of the exercises that the RAF run, we're very used to taking not just the aircraft, but the support teams and all the spares and the maintenance that it requires to different parts of the planet. Maybe we need to look and do a little bit more of is doing more of those more frequently, and possibly for longer periods of time. So we're already having discussions with inside the company as to how we can better prepare for that. Are we going to make some investment in deployable line stations so that we've actually got some decent assets on the ground when it is that we get there? We've started another program of activity to just bring that whole warfighting mindset. It's a challenge that came out of the Strategic Defence Review. The AMS Force Commander made a very powerful presentation to Airbus and to us to say industry needs to step up to this. So he was about a year ahead, I think, at the SDR. And we've responded to that challenge just in terms of helping our people fully understand what it means. Because going back to your point, Sean, if you go back 5-10 years, we've not been in a very kinetic war with anybody. It's been expeditionary operations, deployable operations. That could change, and we don't want to find out that the people aren't ready for it at the point that happens. We're talking to them about it now to look at how we can develop more of that warfighting mindset within the business.
And I also ask Mark, then it segues nicely onto the defence review. It's pretty clear at the moment there's going to be a hell of a lot more money spent in defence over the next 10 years or so, not just nationally, internationally. And the government wants to make defence the foundation of growth for this country, not only for this country, but into the export market as well. I think most metrics, we set a great example with our air-to-air refueling capability. Where do you think the opportunities lie into the export market? Where are the opportunities for growth? Where are the opportunities where we could extend this capability and actually contribute to the growth of the nation as well? In other words, a symbiotic relationship rather than what MOD probably see it as a bit more of a supplier contractor.
So I'm going to pick on 3 examples for that. One is linked back to the question that you had about boom capability. So if we went down the route of replacing some of the existing fleet with MRTT plus, then there's a question for MOD to answer, and I know they're thinking about it, is it 14 aircraft that we require? If the answer to that is yes, and you buy additional MRTT plus, that means you've got surplus aircraft. So we could use those and sell those to another third nation and reinvest that sale money in order to reduce the cost of buying the MRTT pluses. That again would extend the use of MRTT to other countries, but that's not really export. I think the 2 areas that we are looking at, one of them is underway at the moment, one is to look to use and to sell the capability that we have within our maintenance, repair and overhaul, the MRO facility that we've actually got. So we already do some of that for the MMF fleet in Europe, for the multination MRTT force. We already provide we're one of the providers, I should say, of their MRO capability. And the other would be, if we look now at a more NATO-centric and a NATO-first posture, which is what the SDR is now advocating, then the 4 aircraft at the moment that are not part of the RAF core fleet, should we be looking at a way to actually offer those and provide that capability from the UK, from AirTanker, to other nations who maybe haven't invested in MMF or aren't bought into MMF, or indeed to augment the 10 aircraft that they've already got? And that might be another way in which we can look to export some of those skills and capabilities. And then one other example, if you'll allow me, Sean, and we did briefly talk about this when we met, was there's a lot of IPR inside AirTanker. How you would bottle it, how you would frame it, I don't know. But if that was part of some endeavour, whether it was out of Europe or the UK, to stand up a similar capability in other nations, then we would be very interested to look to provide that kernel of IPR that shows how you take on board an aircraft you never had before, how you do the certification, how you build that indigenous capability to the point that it's self-running, and then step back. That might be something else that I know has been considered by some of the team. And we do have regular conversations with Defence Export Organisation as to how we could make that happen. They're very supportive of finding ways to look to project MRTT and MRTT plus to other countries.
I mean, obviously, Mark, it seems to have been a really busy year, a busy decade probably, but the last year has probably just been a bit nuts for all concerned. But wherever I turn to on social media, there's a Voyager somewhere in the world, either picking up a sick F-35 or dropping people off somewhere. How do you see the changes now within Europe? So that we just heard about the mission in Poland, which you referred to. Do you sense here that there's going to be a lot more routine to this, or are you just waiting for whatever happens next?
We try to be as responsive as we can be. I can't see the load getting any less. You're probably aware the Air Force have already recalled two of the shoulder fleet and now part of the Corps. That's been done over several years. Maybe there's a discussion to be had as to whether another aircraft needs to be recalled in order that we can provide the flying lines, the task lines that Air Force Commander needs. Up till now, we've managed that, but we've just added a new one. I'm guessing that's going to be enduring for some time. It's not going to be a couple of weeks. So the only other way to deal with that is to come back and look at reprioritise around the other operations that we're looking to sustain, or the exercises are going to take a little bit of a hit. And of course, that then leads you into a not such a good loop, because you need to do that exercising in order to train people up so they can take on the operational missions. So at some point, I think we'd expect a discussion around whether or not there are additional aircraft that are going to be required to move into the core fleet.
Yeah, well, it's good stuff. I wish you well with that.
Thanks, Greg.
I guess my final question is more, this week, very recently, we've seen Admiral Radakin from the former Chief of the Defence Staff, who's now freer to talk. And one of the things he talked about, Greg and I were bantering about this, was a frustration at the inability to enable defence reform. If you do what you always did, you get what you always got. You've had a lot of experience outside now and very successful in industry. What do you think the MOD needs to do to actually be fit for purpose for this modern world? It feels like there's a sense of agility, there's a sense of urgency, which just isn't in the DNA. What's that magic dust? What do you think is the answer that the MOD needs to do in order to be better prepared for the challenges that it's facing?
I'm just going to reflect on my time in the army. When I finished my career, I landed up working in the Ministry of Defence in the requirement space in an organisation called OR10B, which nobody will remember now. But it used to deal with a lot of urgent operational requirements for the Special Forces. And urgent operational requirements kind of brought a different dynamic to the time, cost and performance triangle that we're always trying to operate within. But it placed a lot more emphasis on time. And we've seen that in the fantastic procurement work that MOD has done in terms of getting munitions and different capabilities into the hands of the Ukrainians through those UORs. So I would have said that somewhere in there's a bit of secret sauce that just needs spreading onto some of those other larger programs. And that's much easier said than done, because there's a long history in terms of the way that culture's set up. But in the end, it requires somebody to look at that time, cost, performance triangle, look at where the risk really sits. And if time is the imperative, then the only way to deal with that is normally to not expect to have something that's 100% perfect, or worse, 110%, where there's been a bit of gold plating, and you actually take something on board that maybe isn't entirely 100% fit for purpose, but which you can iterate on whilst it's in service. And I think in some ways we have done that with Voyager and with AirTanker in terms of the regular upgrades that are provided. We'd like to look into the future beyond boom. We talked about communications nodes. Maybe if we're looking a long way into the future, is there a way for industry and people like AirTanker with their backers to actually generate some kind of an R&D fund that looks at whatever the air-to-air refueling is going to look like in 10, 15, 20 years' time? Because it's probably not going to look exactly the way it does now. And we'd be really open to a discussion about how that could happen.
Well, I'm so grateful for your time. Thank you so much. And this is not being sycophantic. I, as I say, a veteran of air-to-air refueling when it wasn't done very well. And it's very clear that we are very fortunate as a nation to have a availability. I think it's up at 96% or something. It's unheard of from the days we were doing it. Yes, there's always going to be people grumbling, complaining, but with a modern aircraft, a great team. So on behalf of all of us, thank you for what you do, and thanks for giving your time for today.
My pleasure.
So, Greg, I think it was really interesting to have the chief exec of the AirTanker team with us to provide a bit of a perspective, not really a sales pitch for AirTanker, but more just, how that private finance initiative. There were 3 points to come out for me. The first one I think we need to look at is, the world has changed. We're talking about F-35A coming into the inventory. That's a boom. There's other aircraft in inventory. We don't have that tanking capability. Can we really afford to wait until the end of the contract and relet something else? Or really, should we be looking at a way to try to adapt what we've got and make it more relevant for the war fighting today?
Yeah, I mean, there's two ways to look at this. There's the warfighter view, which obviously would want everything and anything it can get its hands on. Why wouldn't it? And then there's the commercial aspect. And I think Mark covered this pretty well. When you've invested all the money that they've invested for a long contract out to 2035, all the sums, all the investment and all the balance of investment are done predicated on that period of contract. So you can't then suddenly just throw it all away or expect them to suddenly modify it in situ. But it sounds to me like they are absolutely up for a conversation about how they modify it from what it already is. And if that requires them then to have that contract extended for, I don't know, argument's sake, 5, 10, 15 years, whatever it might be beyond the current end date, that makes total sense to me, because you can't just start throwing billions of pounds around and not have a sensible time to make that investment pay off. And it sounds like, with the aircraft coming to the life they are at, the fact that we don't have a boom capability and I mean, it sounds to me like, I'm not the MOD and it's not my choice, but I can absolutely see the logic here as to why this is a good time to have a think about how we go beyond 2035. Because if that gives you the opportunity to make changes now, you heard what Mark said, if you order an MRTT now, you're not going to get it for 6 years. So we need to make some decisions and make them soon. Otherwise, we'll wait till 2035, then add 6 years. Now it's 2041. Well, that's not good enough. So yeah, I took great heart from that.
Yeah, because the need for air-to-air refueling is not going down, is it? I mean, just literally this week, talking about committing more, launching jets from the UK, desperately need air-to-air refueling support. And as we heard from Mark, it's all over the world. And we didn't even touch on the fact that Loyal Wingman, the whole idea of long-range drones, there's clearly a conversation as well about how do you refuel drones?
Yeah.
What is that going to look like? So there is a lot in the future in the mix here that we, I don't think it's good enough to say we've contracts out to 2035. We sit on our hands until then.
Yeah.
I think we've got to be flexible. And as you say, respect the fact that industry is trying to do its best. And it may be, I love the idea of selling some of the assets we've got that actually help subsidize. And let's be clear. I mean, one of the things that might sound radical, but I think it's EasyJet and some of those airlines, they swap out their aircraft every few years because the newer ones are 1% more fuel efficient. Yeah. That is enough to justify getting rid of platforms. And therefore, adopting that sort of mentality probably makes financial sense.
Yeah, and I think we knocked a few myths there. I mean, everyone talks about the boom, but everyone also talks about the A400M and the fact that the UK currently hasn't got one. Airbus is a shareholder within AirTanker, and they are the providers of some of that kit. And opening up the contract would allow us to look at that as well, which would take some pressure off. It could absolutely fundamentally change the way we do the Falkland Islands, for example. So look, Mark clearly can't tell us exactly what's going on, but it does sound like there's a conversation happening. There's clearly proposals on the table that would allow the MOD to reopen the contract, albeit probably with an extension in order to get the financial commitment. Because the alternative would be go back into competition and do it all over again. That to me sounds painful, and it's not like it's not working now. Why would we want to throw the baby out of the bathwater? So, yeah, look, it's for others to answer that question and come up with a value for money for argument. But from a warfighter's perspective, the quickest way to give the Air Force the most flexibility seems to be to go with a modification of the current contract.
No, I thought it was fascinating, and it's one of the things we want to do regularly now, isn't it? Is to bring some industry experts in, so that rather than just two grey-haired warfighters championing on. Let's have a chat with industry and see what this looks like from the other side of the fence. But also because if we're going to create a Team UK approach, if we are going to help make defence the foundation of growth for the country, it's got to be a partnership approach. It can't just be driven only by the MOD.
Yeah, and I don't know if this is one of your second or third points, but I what came out for me loud and clear. I mean, Mark's ex-military anyway, so cut him in half, and there's an army. Can't say around. Or what would you cut? What would a soldier have if you cut him in half? Probably a bad liver. But that's a terrible thing to say. The idea here that the company, this is not a PFI that traditionally people view is a commercial entity delivering a service badly normally, to a customer, and everyone falls out and it never works or whatever, or it feels like we're getting ripped off. We've got a company here that is so thick with the reserve and the sponsored reserves and ex-military people, and they have an ethos and a culture. I mean, their job is to literally fly and literally fight. Ideally, we're not going to put a tanker in the fight, but they get pretty close. And a certainly fundamental part of the formation as and when it delivers whatever it's delivering. It's quite heartening to see how one can work, and this one clearly has been. So yeah, that's I think I took that away as a really strong message from Mark, and I've seen it myself, Sean. I've seen it in action when I was serving. And it does work. It does. I mean, it has issues. There are little niggles here and there because you're not dealing with exactly the same sort of person with exactly the same terms and conditions. But it does work. And as you said, he's bringing in new people, new youngsters every year.
Yeah, and I think particularly, occasionally people will tend to focus on one little thing because when we owned all the assets, we could control and, we could get ordered to do things 24/7. But actually, when you do look at it through the harsh reality, I shake my head at the VC10 and TriStar stuff we used to deal with, and some of the really struggled to get the availability. And people take for granted now, and probably quite rightly so, that a sort of mid-90s% availability, people get grumpy because it's not 98%. And you go, well, it wasn't that long ago. And also we are burning considerably less fuel because the Airbus is so much more economic than VC10 and TriStar. In your and my day, those budgets came out of different pots, but the defence enterprise was paying for it all. So, no, I think PFIs have sort of fallen a bit out of favour now. But I think my final point, was, I was interested to hear from his side of the fence. There's a lot of criticism of the MOD and how we contract, and whether actually the whole process needs to be revolutionized in order to make it more of a partnership approach with industry into the export market rather than the customer supplier approach and the desperately long periods of time that takes to get to contract.
Yeah, and obviously, as you said, Tony Radakin brought this up at his speech not long ago. Admittedly, a few days after he left, but sometimes you have to wait for the moment to speak. And he did say that was the area that needed the most effort. And I think, to be fair to the ministerial team, we've heard the right words from them too. They generally talk about a partnership. They generally talk about the growth element. You tease Mark on where they might fit into the growth element, and you gave some really good examples. But I think, industry's not going to criticise, certainly not on our podcast, the current MOD way of doing business, especially if you're trying to renew your contract. But I think we know from speaking to many, many other people that if we can do this better and do it in partnership and get value for money, but also give the industry people, the profit. Tony Radakin actually mentioned this in his speech about understanding and getting the profit right with industry and then getting value for money MOD, because no one's going to do this for free. That's not the way it works. But you absolutely heard it through Mark, is that he's absolutely keen here to deliver a product. And everyone's got to make some money out of this, but at the end of the day, I think this is the future. And I can see why this is not a PFI that's going to die a death and we're going to wave it and say never again. I think this is one that will say we've learned a few things along the way. We absolutely learned about how we need to modify things and keep the contract flexible enough to be able to do things mid-term. But I think there's an opportunity to do that now, and it makes total sense.